Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Christina and I make historical clothing. And today I want to talk to you about feather muffs. Yes, muffs made out of feather instead of fur. These were pretty popular during the Regency era, but also work for some other time periods as well. And so I made one of these in early 2020. I got to use it once before everything got shut down. There was quite a lot of trial and error when I made that one, but it was so worth it. It came out completely glorious. And today I want to share some research with you about this kind of muff and then share with you the process I used as well as some suggestions about things that I would do differently for next time. So, all right, let's get right into it. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were the heyday of feather muffs. Enormous puffs of lightweight feathers seemed to defy gravity like the very birds they came from. Bonnets were also popular places to use feather trimmings. Most fashion plates do not indicate the materials used to make the muff, but we do have extant muffs from this era, so we can guess what the ones shown in fashion plates might be made of. White fur is a possibility, of course. Also, swan skin was used, which may be the actual skin of a swan or hopefully just its feathers. Admittedly, I did not look into this option. The third probability is the most intriguing and doable, and that is a muff covered in feathers. Marabou is cited as a common feather type used for muffs and other fashionable purposes. The marabou stork is a giant, kinda ugly, African bird with a snowy, fluffy breast. I've put him on my Pinterest page along with any images I could find that looked like they might be feather muffs, despite the era. The inspiration for the muff I made was from the book Costume in Detail, 1730 to 1930 by Nancy Bradfield. Pages 121 to 122 describe a muff that is probably of marabou, and she says it was fashionable in the 1820s or as early as the 1780s, but the style also appears in the 1630s. That muff is lined in crimson silk and measures 23 inches by 15 inches with a small bow on each side. It is truly enormous. Because the feathers are so light, these muffs are not heavy though, despite their size. According to Wikipedia, marabou feathers are still used for some commercial items, but things such as Marabou Feather Boas are now made of bleached turkey feathers. This is precisely what we will be using today to make our feather muff. I will link to the Amazon seller I got my boas from. I also purchased some boas in Michael's, or maybe it was Joann's, when I initially made this muff, but they were much skinnier and it was hard to find pure white. Let's gather our materials. We will need white backing fabric to blend in with the feathers. I recommend using crinoline. Crinoline is an open weave stiffened cotton fabric. It usually comes in a very white color, which is perfect for our purposes. We need the stiffness of the crinoline to help the muff hold its shape. I got mine at Joann's, which is my local fabric store. If yours isn't thick enough to hold the shape, consider using 2 layers. We also need lining. Because these muffs are so large, the lining will likely show. I went with a pale pink silk taffeta to match the bonnet I was planning to wear with this muff. I also thought pink was a good neutral to go with whatever else I chose to wear the muff with. But fashion plates show lots of other colors peeking out from inside the muffs. Just about any color will do. For the filling, I used wool quilt batting from a large piece I had, but cotton is just fine. We need to pick the size we want. You are welcome to borrow my dimensions. I'm going to be giving you a lot of numbers, so get your ink and quill ready. You can see the scale of mine in these images from the Huntington Garden and Libraries. Pics are from January 2020. My finished muff with feathers looks about 13 inches by 17 inches if we measure the front flat, but some of that is fluff. My actual backing and lining fabrics were cut at 16 inches across by 23 inches around or long. That's the number that you want to write down and use. This lets us have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Cut your backing and lining fabrics this size. Prep the lining so it will be easy to attach later. Sew the short edges of your lining together to form a tube and press your seams open. Then iron the side edges in 1/2 inch. Cut your batting without the seam allowances, so that's going to be 15 inches by 22 inches. Wrap that around the lining and tack it to the join. Set the lining and batting aside for now. Let's get out the feathers. Have your unboxing party outside if possible. Run your hand along the length of the boa several times to get out any loose feathers. I also cut any feather bits that were poking out funny. Okay, time for more math. For my initial project, I used 6 boas that were each 6 feet long. That seems to be the standard length. And they were mostly attached end to end. This gives you 36 feet of boa. If your backing fabric is 11 inches when finished flat like mine, almost a foot, then each time we wrap the boa around the muff, it takes up about 2 feet. This means we can wrap the boa around 18 times. You want the last wraps to cover the join where the lining is put in. So we do some math and this comes out to the boa strips being about 1 inch apart. Let me be honest here, this was not a cheap project. I kept having to go back for more boas to make it look full, and I ended up using a total of 6 boas and spent at least $50 on feathers. The rest of the materials were fortunately from my stash. Our crinoline is cut out at 16 inches by 23 inches. Don't use spray water or steam to iron it, it may lose some of its stiffness. I don't think I need to say it, but don't get this muff wet. Side note, some parts of this demo are done with white cotton and on a smaller scale to conserve materials. I don't actually need another muff right now, but this part I am doing full scale in crinoline for you, so you can just copy what I do if you want. Now the important part. We are going to mark the lines to sew the feather boas onto. We plan to wrap the boas around in a spiral, so we need our line to be a spiral going around the muff in one continuous line. This can be done with a simple trick and a nice long ruler. Lay out your crinoline on a flat surface. I'm going to be doing this next part in pen so you can clearly see, but you will want to use a light pencil on yours. I'm going to mark the seam allowances, 1/2 inch at the top and bottom where the seam will be, and 1/2 inch on the sides where I will fold in the raw edges. This gives us 15 inches at the top and bottom. We want our boa strips to be 1 inch apart, so we are going to mark each inch at the top and bottom. Now, we want to connect the lines, but we need them offset so we can create a spiral effect when we close up the seam. Draw a line from the 0 point at the top to the 1 inch mark on the bottom. Now draw a parallel line from the 1 inch mark on the top to the 2 inch mark on the bottom. Continue this process for the entire piece of crinoline. As you do this, you can mark about every 6 inches along that line where the boa will be tacked down. It's best if these markings are offset from each other. They don't need to be perfect, and you can always eyeball this as you are sewing later. Once you have all your markings on the crinoline, you can sew up the seam. Have the side where you drew your lines be on the inside and pin the edges together, taking care that the inch markers match up along the stitching line. Sew the seam and press open. You can now turn in the 1/2 inch seam allowance on the edges and sew those down as well. Turn it right side out and admire the glorious 30-something foot long spiral you just created. Or maybe it's bigger. Maybe you are making a monster muff from one of those fashion plates we saw earlier. Okay, now it's time to put on a really good period drama show. Get yourself settled in a comfortable chair with a delicious beverage and sew your feathers on. I would use the centralmost mark as my starting point. Take one boa a few inches from the end and tack it down with white thread. I will use red so you can see clearly. And I just realized that I've been assuming your feather muff will be white, but it doesn't have to be. You can anchor your thread first, then take a stitch through the spine of the boa and tie a knot. Let's do it twice for security. Take another chunk of spine and tie off with another knot. Keep the feathers as free as possible, of course, to keep everything looking fluffy. The reason I start in the middle is because we will need to sew the lining in before we can sew down the boa ends. If we started on an end, we would have to estimate how much extra we needed to do the final wraps, and then that extra would just kind of be dangling there the whole time. When you are ready, attach the next boa end to end with the first one and continue the wrapping process. Stop sewing the boa down when you are at your last inch marker near the turned in edge of the backing fabric. And repeat with more boas on the other side. If you sew the 4 boas in the middle down first, 2 on each side of center, then sew in the lining, you can attach the edge boas after the lining is in. Try not to catch the lining when you tack these down, but it might be a good idea to catch some of the batting to secure it near the edges. Now we can insert the lining and batting. Whip stitch the turned in edges together. And you know, you could even do this with a zigzag on the machine because we're about to cover the stitching. Once the lining is in, pin the boa directly on the seam and tack it down, just like before. Some other ideas for finishing your muff are to add little bows on the bottom side openings, or even a bow on the outside, like we see in the fashion plates. Wow, doing this tutorial made me realize how fiddly it was to sew all the rows down. When I did this, I pinned everything in place before I sewed it and just kind of eyeballed it. But I also ended up needing twice as many boas as I had thought that I would need. So hopefully, me having done this before and being able to tell you, yes, about every inch, and if you just put a pin there, then it will help you. Hopefully that gives you a really good head start. I would absolutely love to hear if anyone else gives this a try and has any thoughts or discovers anything that would make the process easier for people who try it again in the future. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. Links to everything will be in the description. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Go make something glorious.